Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located, everyone. Thank you for joining us for an overview of common and early detection invasive species. So we have invited a panel of botanical experts from the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program who will provide details on several problem species common to Pennsylvania and surrounding states. Our guests will provide tips on how to identify these species and share information regarding their current distribution across our region. Our learning objectives for today are to learn how to identify a sampling of invasive species. We will be made aware of the importance of looking for and knowing about specific species. We will become more aware of the need to report our findings of invasive species to a publicly accessible online platform such as iMapInvasives. To begin our session, I would like to introduce Amy Jewett, who is a coordinator of the Pennsylvania iMapInvasives program. Amy serves as one of 3 administrators for the Pennsylvania iMapInvasives program. In her role, Amy maintains a constant flow of new data coming into the database, provides broad-based support to new and existing users, and trains individuals and organizations in the applications of this resourceful online tool. Amy has developed a community of database users among agencies, consultants, academia, citizen scientists, nonprofit organizations, each with an interest in tracking distribution data of invasive species. She develops educational materials about invasive species and iMapInvasive applications. She reviews invasive species reports submitted to the database and maintains the Pennsylvania iMapInvasives website. So now I will hand the talking stick over to Amy so that she can share more details with us and segue into the introduction of the remaining panelists.
Great. Thank you, Brian, for that very good introduction. So we'll go ahead and get started with our training, overview of common and early detection invasive species. So here's our agenda for today. So before we actually get started on the actual meat of our presentation, each of the presenters will have an opportunity to introduce themselves. Jeff Wagner will be talking about the role of the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program as far as what these organizations are and their role in working with invasive species issues in Pennsylvania. And then the rest of the presenters will be talking about the specific species that we are going to be talking about today. We have a total of 13, and 10 of those are plants, and we also have 1 reptile, 1 insect, and 1 invertebrate. And then we'll wrap up with some tips and resources on how to use iMapInvasives if you find one of these species, links to resources as far as how to manage some of these plants in particular, and then also where some of these plants rank on both the DCNR watch list and also the Pennsylvania noxious weed list as well. And then at the end, we will have some time for questions. So this is our panel. Today we have 5 of us, and for each presenter, and start looking at the slide, we'll go from left to right. So Jeff, we'll start with you. Please say your name and your role in with the Conservancy and the Heritage Program, and just talk a little bit about your role and what you do day to day. So Jeff, go ahead and get us started, please.
Sure. Jeff Wagner, I'm the director of the Natural Heritage Program at Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. I'll talk more about the program and that whole piece. I do a lot of administration. I'm an ecologist by training, and I work with a lot of great people, including the people that will be introduced now.
And Jeff, how long have you been with the Heritage Program now?
29 years.
Wow, long time. And good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Jewett. I'm the Invasive Species Coordinator. Work primarily with the iMapInvasives program, with the Natural Heritage Program, and then also with the Conservancy. There's sort of 2 programs combined together. I've been doing this role since 2013. And Brian sort of talked a little bit about what I do, but in general, I manage the database, the data coming in, We try to recruit and get new users to the platform, and do a lot of training so people understand how to use the program and the many tools that it offers.
My turn?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Steve Grund. I'm botanist with the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and also with the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program. I've a relative newcomer. I've only been with the program for about 26 years. My job primarily is to study the flora of the state with an emphasis on the rare species, where they are, how they're doing, which ones really are rare, which ones are more rare than we thought or less rare than we thought, and what their threats are is a big important part of the documentation we do. And almost every time you find a rare plant, at the top of the list of threats is invasive species. So, you know, it's part of my job, even though it's not my job is not to study invasive species, it has become a very important part of my job of studying rare species. Mary?
Sure. I'm Mary Walsh. I'm an aquatic ecologist by training and work in the program. About half of my time, or a little bit more, is doing aquatic ecology projects related to the native animals in aquatic systems. So I'm not a botanist, but the other part of my job is to work on invasive species projects, the iMapInvasives database and program, which we'll touch on later, and also to participate with the efforts to track and better understand the threats of invasive species in Pennsylvania. And so part of that work relates to the outreach and education components and this aspect of the webinar.
Hi, my name is Pete Woods. I'm an inventory ecologist with the Heritage Program, and I work mostly with invertebrates these days. I've been in this position for 13 years now, and so I go around Western Pennsylvania, mostly looking for trying to document rare species of all kinds, but especially invertebrates such as butterflies, moths, stoneflies, tiger beetles, dragonflies, that kind of stuff. I also spend some time doing invasive plant surveys, which then feeds into management plans and control efforts aimed at managing those species.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. So Jeff, we'll go ahead and turn things over to you.
Okay, I'll be brief because we have a lot of other stuff to get to here. Just to give people an understanding of kind of how this works and where we come from. And I know there are people from out of state who may have not been at all familiar, but Western Pennsylvania Conservancy is where we're all employed, but I'll talk about its role in the Natural Heritage Program in a second. But Western Pennsylvania Conservancy mostly operates in Western Pennsylvania, except for the Heritage Program, and we work statewide. So we do a lot. We're a land trust, and we do a lot of other stuff. So next. One of those things is community gardens and green spaces. This has been a program for almost as long as I've been with the Conservancy, and it's grown quite a lot. And it's not just flower gardens and things in communities, but we're moving into stormwater infrastructure and a lot of pretty substantial things as far as community greening. So that's another aspect of the Conservancy. Next. Tree Vitalize is sort of an outgrowth of that program or that department. And this is a statewide effort. We're one of the major partners. And the whole idea is to plant trees pretty much in urban areas, even though we team up with some other parts of the program to plant trees anywhere we can. Next. And iconically and probably best known, especially for people outside the state, is Falling Water. This is a property that, well, it's a house and it's a property that we own and manage. And it's really managed as a museum. And the 5,000 plus acres around it is managed as a natural area reserve. That's our biggest reserve owned by the Conservancy. So if you haven't gone, it's a great trip. And even in these days when indoor touring is limited, you can go and explore the grounds and hike. It's great. Next. Land protection. So we are a land trust. And at this point, I'm trying to think of the figure. It's over 260,000 acres that we have conserved. A lot of that land was transferred to the state of Pennsylvania, either as forest, state parks, or game lands. And we were involved in a number of state parks projects. This is McConnell's Mill. For those of you familiar with that, it's another kind of iconic state park in Pennsylvania. Next. And a little bit more recently, we developed a watershed conservation program that works, well, again, they've expanded a lot of riparian buffer work, in-stream habitat work, various kinds of conservation oriented at water quality and stream health and structure. And that program has been in place since the early 2000s. Next. And of course, science. Not that these other programs don't enlist the help of science, but we do have focused science effort, conservation science broadly, and then the Heritage Program, which is really the main arm of our science program. Next. And that got moved. I thought we were going to do the Heritage Program, but that got kind of moved in there. What's next, Amy? Okay, there's the Heritage Program. Not sure how that got put in there, but so the Heritage Program is, as I said, statewide. There's a Heritage Program in every state. So for those of you who are out of state, your state has a program and maybe you work closely with them. We're a pretty big program, one of the largest in the country. And but we do the same thing that all heritage programs do, and that's work to help conserve biodiversity in the state. Next. And we're a partnership. A lot of programs are just purely embedded within state government. We're a partnership between Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and 3 state agencies: Fish and Boat Commission, Game Commission, and the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. And there's really been a lot of strength in that partnership, and it's really helped us navigate our way through Pennsylvania physically and administratively. And it's at the bottom of the slide there, but we're a member of NatureServe, which is the kind of umbrella network organization for all heritage programs. So from Canada into Latin America, including all of North America, that's our kind of umbrella organization, and we work closely with them. And it's really important for us, particularly in terms of how we collect data, how we roll that data out, and how we scale it up from local jurisdictions all the way up to national jurisdictions. Next. Yeah, just a couple, that's really some more facts about NatureServe. This is even an old slide, but as you can see, it's pretty much all of North America, and it's getting to be a majority proportion of South America. Next. And our function, as I said, is to conserve biodiversity, and inventory is a kind of our bread and butter. Our experts, like we'll talk to you today, we have quite a number of experts in a lot of different taxes. It allows us to really do a pretty holistic job, even though there are still expertise and taxa that we still have to make some headway, but we have a lot covered with the staff that we have. Next. And data is the other bread and butter. We inventory, we collect data, and we provide that data to a lot of partners, including our state agencies who review permits, do environmental review. All states have some kind of form of that. And so we're up, and this is an old slide too, but we have over 30,000 records now representing all the species that we track in Pennsylvania. Next. And we're still doing more heritage programs. So we're on to the IMAP portion of the program. And Amy, am I still proceeding on this? Is this my slide?
Yes, Jeff, keep going.
Okay. So as people have talked about, invasive species have become an increasingly large part of our emphasis, of our focus. Unfortunately, we're trying to focus on the rare elements, but it's such an overwhelming threat that we cannot not focus on invasives and try to alleviate some of the threats to our natuaries and to the species of concern. And when we started iMapInvasives and got involved in it, you know, it was a small effort. New York State was really the leader and still is, but it's grown a lot. And since Amy's come on and we've expanded the program, we've made a lot of headway. And it is it is now a hosted function at NatureServe. So our umbrella organization is hosting iMapInvasives, and all states are feeding into that. And it's still early on, but we're still working out administratively how all that works. But the point is, this is a heritage product, and this is something that programs collectively can participate in. And when you take the invasives data and put it next to the rare species data, you have some pretty powerful collaborations that can happen there. And that's what we hope to do. Next. We kind of missed this slide early on. It was stuck in, but I can just go from here. So our role in invasive species management has increased, and we were funded primarily through federal monies, a lot from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which has been really important to the states bordering the Great Lakes, not just for invasives work, but a lot of other work. But this has really helped fund and continue this program. And we've been counting on this funding for a long time, and we're hoping to make headway in terms of getting state funding to continue these efforts. And we're getting there. Pennsylvania is getting there. And the slide that was previous was to just talk about the governors. It's a governor's appointed Pennsylvania Invasive Species Council, which is a group of NGOs and agencies that get together and try to make headway for the invasive species management plan that Pennsylvania has adopted. And we're part of that. And that group, that council, is really pushing to roll out invasive species management statewide. And all we need is funding. And we're hoping that in the next few years, particularly as state budgets recover after the pandemic, that we can make some headway there. Next. And here we are on the species profile.
Yep. Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, so here's the species that we'll be talking about today. Steve Grund is going to get us started off with the first three. Pete Woods will take over and do the next four. I will be talking about the following three, and then Mary will wrap up with the last three on the list. So we will go ahead and get started with Steve and his section.
Okay, we're going to start with autumn olive. Before I get into that, I just want to point out that, you know, there are a lot of invasive species, and in an hour-and-a-half program, we can't get into it very far at all. And so one thing that I think it would be good to think about while we're presenting these species is not just the specifics of this species, but to get an idea of how it is that we figure out what something is. And hopefully you probably have iMapInvasives on your phone. I really encourage you to get iNaturalist. Those are both free apps, and I highly recommend the Flora Virginia app for identifying plants. You're not going to find much in Pennsylvania that's not in Virginia, and it's just a really useful, user-friendly application. So our first species here is autumn olive, and it's in, not sure the common name of the family, it's the Elaeagnus family, and it is characterized by these scales, especially on the bottoms of the leaves. It gives it that real silvery look you see on the right. You can see on the fruit photo there, you can see more specifically the individual scales. So it's on really all parts of the plant almost. And when you see these scales, you're pretty much, if they are this solid and silvery, you're pretty much in this plant family. It's a shrub. It's usually a large shrub. It can even get to be a small tree. I come from Michigan, and one of the natural communities that we have in Michigan that's very important is what we call oak openings. It's a type of savanna, and there's enough light that gets in through the trees that this thing just takes off, and it's just completely taken over those communities, except where it's managed very carefully. They introduced it in Michigan to try to establish a reproducing pheasant population because they like to eat these, and they weren't successful in doing that, but the autumn olive did really well, unfortunately. And similarly, they used to plant it, I hope they don't anymore, by the Pennsylvania Game Commission. So it's primarily, you see it in old fields, in places that maybe get occasionally mowed, where the trees have either been removed or they are few in number. And in the parks that you manage, you probably have a lot of that habitat. The fruits, when you see red fruits, it's a very good sign that they're eaten by birds. And so once the Game Commission stops planting them, they're going to still move around on their own. They're edible. They're not bad tasting, but please don't get the idea of growing them for their fruits. They're not that good. Okay, next slide, please. So you can see on the bottom left, the leaf shape is quite variable. They can get bigger and wider than the one on the right, and they can be fairly narrow. But if you think it might be autumn olive, turn a leaf over. That's how you tell. That silvery look from the scales. Okay, next. Now there is another Elaeagnus that goes by the name Russian olive that's been in Pennsylvania for a lot less time, but it's a huge problem in Western North America, and it is increasing. It's definitely increasing in Pennsylvania. Very similar in terms of the form of the shrub and the habitats that it grows in. The leaves are more long and narrow, but it still has that silvery look, and you see it has white fruits rather than red. Next. So here's the map of the Russian olive, and you can see in the map on the left that it's all over the West. And if you look 10 years ago, you'd only see a few counties in the east. And so it's definitely on the increase. The map on the right is the iMapInvasives map, shows which counties. Now, you're not going to see an exact match between those maps, but there's two reasons because for each species, I think we're going to have something, either these two maps or something very similar. The map on the left there is from the Biota of North America project. And incidentally, the solid blue you see is just telling you that it's present in that state, but the light blue, and that it's not native is why it's blue. The light blue means it is present in that county. It has been documented in that particular county. The pink on these maps, in those states, it's the species is actually has regulatory status as a noxious weed. Okay, so if it's just that kind of brownish color, it means it's not been documented from that state. Now, what does documentation mean? It's different on these two maps. The BONAP maps are produced based entirely on scientific specimens at museums. So one thing that does is it gives you a longer record, okay? But it also misses a lot of places where people know where it is, but they've not collected a scientific specimen. On the other hand, the iMap invasive maps, actually Amy has entered a lot of historic data based on specimens, so a lot of that has been picked up, but you also get, in some cases, you get a more of a real-time record because you have a lot of people out there with the ability to put records in this database. So it's nice to have different kinds of data. They tell you a little bit different story. Okay, next slide.
Steve, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to let you know it's almost 1:30, so we're
okay. All right,
on time.
so speed it up. Okay, so next we have the same maps for autumn olive, and it's kind of the reverse story. This one started out in the east, and they're starting to get it in the west. Okay, let's move on. Now, Amy asked me on some of these to give some information on the flowers, and I decided to use that as an excuse to go into a little bit more depth on this plant family, because my other two species are in the pea family. And it's really, like I said, what you really want to do is learn how to identify things. And so hopefully we will help you do that by giving you some examples. And if you learn plant families, it can really help you figure out what something is. So in the pea family, we have these flowers. They're bilaterally symmetric, like one side is a mirror image of the other, rather than you think of a typical flower as radiating out from the center. So, and the fruits, probably everyone knows what a legume is in terms of the fruit, and that is the name of the fruit of the legume family. So next slide, please. The flowers have a specialized structure. The top petal is the biggest, and it's called the banner or the flag. And that's probably it's really is a flag or a banner advertising to pollinators, who then then the lateral petals are called wings, and functionally for some, like butterflies, these function as a landing pad to get to the reproductive parts, next slide, which are enclosed in the fused lower two petals, which are called the keel because it creates a keel shape. And so the reproductive parts are in there, and so that's where the insects need to go to get and deliver pollen. So next slide. So getting, you see, so here are a bunch of examples of flowers in the pea family. They'll look very different, but they also have a very similar structure, which after a while you get used to this and you go like, oh, that's a legume flower. Okay, and if you see the clover, you might say that looks different, but that's a head of small flowers. And so you look at the individual flowers and you see, oh yeah, that's the same sort of structure. Okay, next slide. So two examples of invasive species in the legume family. This is Chinese bush clover. You can see the flowers in the upper right. It's actually an herb. It's not a shrub, but it looks like a shrub, and it's almost a shrub. It has these separate stems that come up from the ground, and sometimes they branch at the base, but it dives back to the ground every year. It has these three parted leaves you see there on the lower left, and that's another characteristic of the legume families. They have compound leaves, so each leaf in this case consists of 3 leaflets. Okay, next. Yes, Sericea lespedeza, somebody pointed out, is another common name for it. And Sericea refers to the silvery look, not as silvery as Iliagnus, but these have hairs on the bottom of the leaves that give it a silvery look. Yeah, you see those, the pea-like flower there, all right? Next slide. So the whole plant gets this characteristic look of these radiating stems that make it look like they're combined into a single shrub, but they're actually all individual plants. Typically you see it on edges, often along streams. Next. So Amy wanted us to do lookalikes. We don't have any real good lookalikes, but we do have some other legumes that have long, narrow leaflets. The one on the left there is obviously a much smaller plant, and so you're not going to confuse that. But the leaves are fairly similar. They're 3-parted. The other two have what we call pinnately compound leaves. The different leaflets are on a central axis instead of being radiated from a common point. So you have both kinds of compound leaves in this family. Next, you can see the sericeous look. If you go back for just a second, on the upper right hand photo there, the one on the left is the underside of the leaves, and that's what they mean by sericeous. Okay, next. There's a distribution map. It's moving north. It's probably already in most of the more northern counties in Pennsylvania, or will be soon. Next. Okay, my last species is kudzu, famously the plant that ate the South. It really ate the edge habitats of the South. It's, you know, people, they see pictures like this and they think if they go to the South, it's going to be everywhere. It's not really like that, but it certainly can do that. And they used to say it's not going to get this far north. Well, it's here. And it's up in Traverse City, Michigan. So, and the climate's warming, so it's going to be increasing in Pennsylvania. Next. You see again a 3-parted leaf there on the left. It has a distinctive look, although you'll see another look that it can have in a second here. But it's got the leaflets, the 3 leaflets, they narrow abruptly to what we call an acuminate tip. Okay, so that's a characteristic. Some of the leaflets are more lobed, as you'll see in a second. The legumes have this beautiful gold color. It's backlit here, but that is the color. And these pea family flowers. Okay, next. So in terms of lookalikes, well, it's a vine. So even though that large trefoil on the left looks almost exactly like the kudzu leaves from the previous slide, in terms of that acuminate tip and their three-parted compound leaves, but it's a little herb. So you're not likely to mistake it. Next. Probably the closest look-alike is poison ivy. I've found that people tend to learn what poison ivy looks like, even though in some ways it's not the easiest plant to identify because it varies so much in how toothed the lobes, the different leaflets are. Sometimes there's no teeth at all. Sometimes they can have a lot of teeth, but you get to know this plant, especially if you are sensitive to it. But you see on the kudzu on the left there, the lobes are more rounded, and yeah, poison ivy can have an acuminate tip to some degree, but it's not as pronounced as on kudzu. And it's a different color, and it's a different kind of vine. Kudzu, the stem wraps around the trees, and that's how it gets up the tree. Whereas poison ivy has a vine that puts out these little hair-like roots and attaches to the bark of the tree, which is something to look out for in the winter because you can get poison ivy in the winter. So learn to identify it by those hair-like roots coming from the vine stem. Okay, next. There's the map. It's almost certainly is an underestimate of the, but it does tend to, for some reason, to come into the cities first. Partly because they're a little warmer, I think, but anyway, it's on the move. It's still going to move further north. Next. So, you know, if you go to the south, be aware of your surroundings. Don't stand in one place for too long. Don't drive too slowly. And with that, I think I hand it off to, is it Pete?
Me. Hello. I'd like to introduce you to porcelainberry. You can think of this as kudzu light. It hasn't eaten the South, but it has eaten a chunk of Philadelphia. This is a woody vine, and it looks a whole lot like a grapevine. In fact, it's in the same family as grapes are, the Vitaceae. And from a distance, it looks almost exactly like a grape. It has the same growth habit. It'll grow up on top of shrubs and onto trees and kind of smother them the same way that some grapes can. And it occurs in disturbed places, along edges, along roads, edges of fields. And it has berries with seeds, so it's spread by birds. And it got here through, through the horticultural industry and people basically planting it as an ornamental. The berries are very pretty. The only look-alike, I would say, is a grapevine. Next slide, please. Looking at the leaves here, porcelainberry on the left and grape on the right. Sometimes porcelainberry leaves are lobed and grape leaves can be lobed, and sometimes they're less lobed, and just as some grape leaves are less lobed. So if it's not in fruit, it might be a little hard to tell them apart sometimes just looking at the leaves. Next. But if it is in fruit, you'll notice that it just looks really weird for a grape. You know what grapes look like. They grow in clusters, and those clusters are kind of long and dangly. And they gradually ripen from a green color to a purplish color, and then they get this waxy bloom on them. The porcelainberry has a different shaped cluster. It starts out as an upright, flat cluster, although by the time the berries are there, they've often weighed it down, so it's dangling, but it still has that flat shape. It's not a long cluster like grapes. And the berries they're a different shape. They're sort of fatter than a grape, and the colors are very different. There's usually a combination of colors from greens, blues, purples, pinks, sometimes white. It's really a striking plant there. But if it's not in fruit, you have to look a little closer to tell the difference between them. Next. So it is a woody vine like a grape, but where grapes have this shreddy bark that comes away in little strips, porcelainberry has ridges and furrows in the bark, but the bark doesn't slough away. And if you look closely at those two upper pictures, the porcelainberry has those little dots along the twig, and those are lenticels. That's where the twigs breathe through that. Grape does not have those lenticels. And if you're still not sure which one you're looking at, you can, if you have a knife, you can cut into the vine and look at the pith. The pith of a grape is brown, like you see on the right there, whereas the pith of a porcelainberry is always white. And also, the porcelainberry pith, it's continuous throughout the inside of that vine, whereas the grapevine pith is discontinuous, where there's a node, that's where there's a branching point in the stem. The pith will stop and it will be solid wood for that short interval. So it looks a lot like grape from a distance, but you get up close, there are differences there. Next. So right now, this is mostly in the bigger cities. There's a lot around Philadelphia, as I said. It's starting to become more common here in Pittsburgh, but I think it's starting to get out away from the cities a little bit. So please be on the lookout for porcelainberry. Next. The next one is water chestnut. This one is, it can be a really serious weed in still water or slowly flowing water. It's rooted at the base, so it roots into the soil under the water, and it has a stem that's up to 16 feet long. So any water that's less than that deep, it can successfully colonize it and take it over and grow very densely to the point where oxygen and sunlight just is not able to penetrate into the water column anymore. It's a very distinctive plant. This one has no lookalikes. The picture on the left there, you can see the diamond-shaped leaves that form in a rosette around, well, not really a rosette, but it's the point where the vine comes up and touches the surface. Next slide. And if you were to turn that rosette of leaves over, you'll see these inflated bladders on the stems, and that's how it stays up on the surface. Those are filled with air, so they're little floats that keep the plant up there. And you can also see that below the surface leaves, there are submerged leaves that are more thread-like. And those are able to, do photosynthesis underwater until the plant, before the plant is able to reach up and get to the surface. Even if it's winter or spring and the plant has died back, it's still very distinctive because you can find these seed pods. It's how it gets one of its other names, water caltrop. A caltrop is that medieval weapon that has 4 points. It's tetrahedral shaped, so one point is always sticking straight up. So if these are on the ground, you don't want to step on them with bare feet, because one point is always sticking straight up. It's this big, weird, crazy looking seed pod. This is actually this is related to the edible water chestnut. I think that's a different species. You can eat these, and the pod there is the edible part. You have to peel off the outer covering to get to the seed inside. I've never actually seen this plant myself. I haven't had a chance to eat it either. So this one, it's very, very distinctive, not likely to be confused with anything else. And if you go to the next slide, you can see on the map that it has popped up in a number of places, especially in the eastern part of Pennsylvania, but it's at severe risk of being introduced to many other bodies of water. So please keep an eye out for this one. Next, this is small carpetgrass, Arthraxon hispidus. This is a newcomer along the southern edge of Pennsylvania. It's an annual grass. It's low growing. It starts out as kind of an upright stem, but then it flops over a little bit as it gets too tall to keep itself upright. It occurs in disturbed areas. It occurs along roads. It'll show up along streams. Strangely, it's almost always, at least every time I found it, it is growing alongside Japanese stiltgrass, which is another one that you should get to know. I find grass identification to be nearly impenetrable. They're just a lot harder than a lot of other plants, for me anyway. But this grass is distinctive enough that I think you will notice it. If you see that how the leaves are, they're very wide and relatively short. And also they've got that wavy edge to them. If you see that, then stop and look closer. We do have some native wide-leaved grasses. Next slide. The one that you'll most likely see is the native deer tongue grass. And they look a little similar in this photo, although in real life the deer tongue grass is a lot bigger. It also doesn't have the wavy edges that small carpetgrass has. Both of these species can be very fuzzy on the sheath. That's where the leaf wraps around the stem and goes down it. That sheath is very fuzzy on both of these. But if you look at where the arrow is on the small carpetgrass, if you look at the edge of the leaf, you'll see long hairs around the very edge of the leaf. And that's distinctive, and the deer tongue grass does not have that. And also the deer tongue grass doesn't have that wavy, undulating edge on the leaf. Next. There are a couple other wide-leaved invasive grasses. On the left is the Japanese stilt grass that I mentioned earlier. This one I recognize by looking for that reflective silvery stripe that goes down the center of each leaf. If you see that, you know you've got Japanese stilt grass. And that one is becoming very common all across Pennsylvania right now. On the right is wavy-leaved basket grass. This is an up-and-coming invader. It's only showed up in a few places in Pennsylvania. It actually looks quite a bit like small carpetgrass, but it's a lot bigger than small carpetgrass. So in any case, if you see that the wide, relatively short leaves with that wavy edge, look very close and please document it, because it's going to be one of those two species. Next slide. So as I said, this one is just getting into the area from the south, and haven't seen it anywhere in northern Pennsylvania, just the few rows of counties on the south there. But it seems to be spreading quickly from what I've seen. I never saw it at all until just a couple years ago, and now it's popped up in several places. Next slide. Purple loosestrife is as noxious as it is beautiful. This one is it's a very distinctive plant. It grows in wetlands, and it's a tall plant up to 2 meters or more tall, and it has these spikes of bright purple flowers. It's almost always in wetlands, occasionally in uplands, and it can grow in very dense thickets like this. Next slide. This plant has square stems, and the leaves have smooth edges, unlike another one that I'll show you in a minute. And the different pairs of leaves alternate the direction. So if one pair of leaves is pointing north and south, the pair below that is going to be pointing east and west. Next slide. There are other native plants that are tall with spikes of purple flowers, and blue vervain is one of those. I wouldn't have said this one was a lookalike for purple loosestrife, but I heard about a case where a crew of people was sent out to eradicate a big stand of purple loosestrife, and they pulled it all out, and only later on someone figured out that they destroyed a big stand of blue vervain, which is, it's a beautiful native plant. It's a great nectar plant for our pollinators. So please identify your plants carefully before you go out and eradicate them. Double check the ID, triple check the ID. I was once working as an intern at a nature center, and the director of the nature center one day came and told me about how he had led a crew of people to go out and kill all the Norway maple at this site we were restoring. And I said, "What Norway maple?" And he said, "Oh, it's all over there. It's like, it's everywhere." And I realized he was talking about the sugar maples. They had gone out and they killed all the sugar maples, and I just wanted to cry. So, and he didn't last very long in that job, surprisingly. So please, yes, double check and triple check your IDs. If you want to send us photos, you could do that. It's probably easier if you just post something on iMap or on iNaturalist. You can just get confirmation from the community of botanists out there that you have what you think you have. Always good to make sure. Next slide. There are a couple native loosestrifes that look similar if you get up close to them. On the right there is winged loosestrife, which is native. It's also a rare plant in Pennsylvania. I've actually never seen it. It's mostly in the southeast part of the state. And it has little wings running down the stem below the edges of the leaves. So in that way it looks different, but it's also just a smaller plant, and it has leaves, or it has flowers in the leaf axils scattered along the whole stem, whereas purple loosestrife, it's like it's a big terminal cluster, big cluster on the tip of the stem. So you're probably not going to probably not going to see winged loosestrife and think that it's purple loosestrife, but the flower structure is very close if you do see it.
Do they survive in different habitats, or would you find them in a similar kind of area?
I think the habitat is similar, but never having met winged loosestrife, I'm not sure. Steve, can you comment on that?
Well, I seen winged loosestrife way long ago in Michigan, and I can't speak to the exact habitat, but I can pretty much guarantee you that purple loosestrife can probably grow in winged loosestrife habitat, because it can grow in pretty much any wetland, and also along streams and rivers and in scour areas that may not look wet, but get wet enough that this plant can get a foothold.
Okay, I'm looking at a book here. Winged loosestrife grows in wet meadows and marshy shores and swamps and ditches. So sounds like the habitat is fairly similar. Next slide. So purple loosestrife has gotten out pretty much everywhere at this point, and everywhere around Pennsylvania. Often though, you don't see stands that are as dense as that first slide, because this is one of the biological control success stories. There are several species of beetle that only eat purple loosestrife. They've been introduced from their native range in Europe. And back in the 90s, we were spreading these all around the region. And they do a pretty good job of controlling the really dense infestations of purple loosestrife. but you'll still find it in some places, and sometimes it gets thick enough that you'll want to take control measures and do something about it. Not all sites are amenable to the persistence of the beetles. Like if there's deeper water, the beetles won't usually survive over winter. And then it'll be more necessary to go in with some other control method to work on the loosestrife. Next slide. Oh, and this one is Mary's.
Yeah,
no,
I'll take over
Amy.
from here. Yeah, Mary will be doing the last section. Okay, great. Thanks, Pete. So I'm going to talk to you about mile-a-minute vine. The scientific name is Persicaria perfilita. It's also known as devil's tear tear thumb, and that's actually a very good name for it because I want to show you some pictures here coming up in the next slide for why it has that name. It's not one that you want to touch. So mile-a-minute will invade the open and disturbed areas, generally ones that get a lot of sunlight, so places like fields and forest edges, and it also does like some wet places as well, so stream banks, wetlands, and then just in general some roadsides. So you will see this plant pretty commonly in places that people will frequent. It is a Class B noxious weed in Pennsylvania. And one of the reasons why I think it probably is such a noxious plant is because of its rapid growth. So it gets its name because in peak growing season, it can grow up to 6 inches per day, which is crazy to think about. So if you let this plant take over, it certainly will take that opportunity and do just that if no management is put into place. So you can see in this photo here that it does produce these very thick tangles of vines, and it will overtake other plants that are in the area, so other herbaceous and woody species. And it is known to also be able to climb up into trees also. And so when it does that, when it takes over these other plants, it will eventually kill them because it blocks the sunlight and doesn't let these other species photosynthesize. And so eventually over time, all you will have is mile-a-minute, or perhaps another invasive species that's very hardy in an area. So here's where mile-a-minute can get its other name, the devil's tear thumb. So it has these recurved barbs, both on the stem and also on the underside of the leaf blades. So again, this is why you want to be very, very careful if you're in an area that has this species. And make sure that you do not get tangled up in it yourself. It is able to get spread by animals and humans, and also by water flow. And it has these distinctive circular cup-shaped structures called ochrea that you can see in the photo on the right that surround the stem at the nodes. So that is one of the features of this plant that is another distinguishing characteristic that you can use in identifying it. So there is at least one other look-alike. This is a native species called halberd-leaved tear thumb. So you can see that the leaf structure is similar in appearance, but it is slightly different. It's the mile-a-minute is much more triangular shaped, whereas the halberd-leaved tear thumb has kind of a different type of triangular shape to it. So similar, but again, as Pete had mentioned in his slides, getting up close to these species is when you can really, hopefully in most cases, easily tell the difference between them. Here's the distribution for this species. So in both platforms, in both the Biota of North America program and in iMapInvasives, we can see that this species is fairly widespread across the states. And unfortunately, it's probably spreading to other places that have not yet been documented. And so that's why, as each of us go through and talk about reporting, that's why it's so important to be reporting your finds of these species, because that helps other people to know where they are, and also that, these places probably should be undergoing some kind of management. The next species I'm going to talk about is bush honeysuckle. The scientific name is Linicerispa. So this is actually a variety of different species. It's not just one. So when we talk about bush honeysuckle, or also called shrub honeysuckle, based on the form that these plants will take, we're talking about 5 different species, at least in Pennsylvania anyway. So Amur honeysuckle, Morrow's honeysuckle, Bell's honeysuckle, Standish's honeysuckle, and Tatarian honeysuckle. The Bell's honeysuckle, just to point that out, is actually a hybrid between the Morrow's honeysuckle and the Tatarian honeysuckle. Another honeysuckle that I think a lot of us may also be familiar with is Japanese honeysuckle, but that is not part of the bush honeysuckle complex, if you want to call it that, because Japanese honeysuckle actually grows as a vine. It is not a shrub. So bush honeysuckle, you will find it in places that get a lot of sunlight. So forest openings and edges along roadsides and abandoned agricultural fields. And again, just other places where sunlight is easily able to penetrate the tree canopy. So for an example, if you have an area that just recently had a timber harvest completed, that will then be prime habitat for bush honeysuckle to potentially take over that area. This species, because it is one that really does like the sunlight, it is one that you're not typically going to find in mature forest interiors because it is relatively shade intolerant. It really does need that sunlight to thrive. But other places that you may find some other species like the Morrow's and the Bell's honeysuckle can be kind of more wet areas like bogs and fens and lake shores and also sand plains. So you can really find the bush honeysuckle in a variety of different places. So as far as identifying this species, it grows to up to 20 feet in height, anywhere from 6 to 20 feet. It does have very fragrant flowers. I think a lot of times many of us in the summer will smell honeysuckle. It does smell very good, but a lot of times it might actually be coming from an invasive plant, unfortunately. The flowers are comprised of 4 petals and they do vary in color. They will usually start out as a white color and then turn yellow or pink as they get a little bit older, as they age throughout the season. Honeysuckle does produce these round berries, and that usually happens as far as when the berries replace the flowers will be about midsummer, and the berries can be orange, red, or pinkish in color. The leaf arrangement on the stem is opposite, not alternate. So you can see in the picture in the upper or the top section there that the leaves are opposite from one another on the stem. And one of the surefire ways to know for sure if you have a bush honeysuckle rather than a native honeysuckle is to take a stem off the plant, crack it open, and look inside at the pith. And if the pith is hollow, like what you can see in this photo, then it is very likely an invasive type of honeysuckle. If the pith is solid, it is very likely a native honeysuckle. So that's one of the ways that you can easily identify these species. So as far as the ecological impacts of this species, it is able to outcompete our native vegetation, which in any case with any of these species, you know, a lot of them are very good at outcompeting our native vegetation. And that may, you know, be a point that is easy to kind of gloss over on, but native vegetation is incredibly important because our wildlife are in tune with that native vegetation, and without it, they cannot survive. They don't have the food sources they need. They don't have the habitat they need. So anytime we have an invasive species that's known to outcompete our native vegetation, that is a really big point that we want to make and make sure that we kind of bring that home to folks to understand that we really want to, you know, protect and help our native species and our plants thrive. And invasive species are doing the opposite, unfortunately. Something that is interesting to note, you know, we see that bush honeysuckle produces a plethora of berries. And in this photo here, we can see a robin that's eating those berries. And we might think, oh, well, that's a plant that's actually featured because providing a food source. But in this case, and with many cases with other invasive species, the fruit and food that it produces is not actually what the wildlife need. So in this case, the berries that bush honeysuckle produces are full of carbohydrates that will fill up the animal, but it will not actually give them the nutrition that they need. And so a lot of times people refer to invasive fruit or like the berries of the bush honeysuckle as junk food for wildlife. Whereas our native species produce fruit and berries that are high in fat and have a lot of really good nutrients that, especially when birds are ready to migrate, they need that diet to go and migrate the distances that they do. And so, you know, whenever we have an area that is just a monoculture of, you know, invasive species like bush honeysuckle, that is essentially not providing the habitat and the food sources that our wildlife need. Another thing that's interesting to note is that in shrub honeysuckles or bush honeysuckles, nest predation is actually much higher as compared to in our native shrubs. And I think a lot of that is because the birds will generally build their nests lower to the ground in bush honeysuckle. And so then that allows the predators to more easily access these nests. Whereas if they were able to nest in our native shrubs, that's much more of a safer location for them. Okay, there we go. Okay, and then just some lookalikes. These are both native species to be aware of. So we have fly honeysuckle and northern bush honeysuckle. So just looking at these photos and the leaves and the berries and the northern bush honeysuckle here has the flowers as well. It may not always be enough to tell the difference between these. So again, the way to really tell for sure is to get a stem off the plant, crack it open, and look inside at what that pith looks like. And if it's hollow, it's very likely that bush honeysuckle, whereas if it's a solid pith, it's probably one of our native honeysuckles. And here is the distribution map. So I did not actually include the distribution map for the bush honeysuckle because there is 5 different species that we're talking about here. So if you'd like to see the distribution maps for those species, you can actually click on the link that's here where it says access BONUP with the star next to it. And all you have to do once you're in the database is to actually look up a species by the scientific name. But we can see here, just looking at the data from iMapInvasives, that bush honeysuckle is very widespread across the state. And I did look at some of the maps from BONUP when putting this PowerPoint together. And some of those counties that are not highlighted orange in IMAP do actually have instances of bush honeysuckle. So probably at this point, it's almost in every county in the states, unfortunately. So it is very widespread. And the last species that I'll be talking about is knotweed species. So the scientific name for these species, because I'll be talking about more than just one, Renoitria species or Fallopian species. Some places also refer to it as polygonum. So it can be referred to in a variety of ways, but it's all talking about knotweed. And in Pennsylvania anyway, when we talk about knotweed species, we're talking about at least 3 different ones. So Japanese knotweed, giant knotweed, and Bohemian knotweed. And the Bohemian knotweed is a hybrid between the Japanese and the giant knotweed. And identification between these 3 can be pretty tricky. So just some things to keep in mind. So the Japanese knotweed leaves will be, in comparison to the giant knotweed and the Bohemian, a little bit smaller. The base of the leaf will also be squared. If you're looking at the giant knotweed leaves and the Bohemian knotweed, those leaves can be up to 1 foot long. So they can be very big. And the base of the leaf on both the giant knotweed and the Bohemian knotweed will be rounded or curved. So that can be something else to look at. But just looking at the size of the leaf alone may not necessarily be a good indicator because things can vary very much. So looking more at the base of the leaf will probably be very helpful in helping to distinguish between these species. So knotweed can invade a variety of different habitats. It does like both wet and dry areas. So you will find it in wetlands, stream corridors, but also along forest edges. You will very likely see it or already have seen it as you're driving along, and you'll see it along the roadside. You'll see it along railroad tracks and also utility right-of-ways. Pretty much any other kind of disturbed area, knotweed will easily invade those places. In Pennsylvania, it is a Class B noxious weed, and it was brought to North America for a variety of different uses, just for ornamental use in people's gardens, but also for forage and erosion control. And kind of ironic that after it's already been introduced, we later find out knotweed actually helps to promote erosion rather than help to prevent it. So yeah, bad move on our part, unfortunately. So as far as the ecological impact of the species, if you take a look in that top picture, you can see that that's the riparian corridor, that the sides of that river have been completely overtaken by one species, and that is knotweed. And so anytime you have an area like that that's been completely overtaken by an invasive species, you are automatically looking at an area that has decreased biodiversity, because our native plants and animals cannot survive in an area like that. They just can't compete with that. And our animals especially, you know, they don't derive nutrients or food from a species that's invasive. They have not co-evolved with that species over time, that they just can't use it. And so those areas are going to be depleted of our native wildlife, unfortunately. Places like that will also have degraded water quality, because in storm events, that river will be eroded over and over again, because the knotweed that's along the banks is not holding the soil. In fact, it's actually helping to loosen it. And so that area over time will change dramatically, and not in a good way, unfortunately, because of the presence of knotweed. You can see in the photos here on the bottom that knotweed is very hardy. It actually can go through and up into pavement, believe it or not. And so there has been a lot of news articles and other information online talking about the damage that knotweed can do to human infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, and home foundations. So if this is near your home, be aware of that, because this is something that can definitely cause some trouble, unfortunately. So a common lookalike that sometimes people will confuse knotweed with is bamboo, but there is some ways that you can tell them apart pretty easily. So in wintertime, knotweed will lose its foliage, and you can see that here in the photo, kind of in the middle area. Whereas bamboo, during year-round, the papery leaves that it produces will persist all year. And then also, if you would cut the stem of knotweed, you'll see that it actually is very wet after cutting it, because it's a herbaceous species. Whereas with the bamboo, the stems are much more woodier, and they're definitely, they don't have that softness to it like a knotweed stem would have. And then finally, the distribution for this species, again, because I'm talking about several different species, I wasn't able to include the maps here, but again, if you access BONAP on your own, you should be able to go in, look up the scientific name, and easily pull up those distribution maps. But here, as far as what we have documented in iMapInvasives so far for knotweed, we do have it in at least 2/3 of the state. Very likely it's in almost every county at this point. It's just another one of those species or subset of species that is very prevalent, unfortunately. Okay, I'm going to turn things over to Mary, and she will wrap us up with the last 3 species.
All right, great. Yeah, I'll talk about some non-plants in these last few slides here. And we are kind of getting towards the end here, but I'll try to leave at least a couple of minutes for questions. But I wanted to touch on the red-eared slider, an invasive turtle. That's a common pet, and it gets introduced to lakes and ponds when people don't want their pet turtle anymore. It's a medium-sized turtle that's distinctive from others because it has that red stripe behind its eye, and so no other, you couldn't confuse it with any other turtle because of that red stripe. And they do also have a yellow stripe on some of the scutes, or the raised areas on the top shell that you can see in that picture on the top right of the slide. And when they are basking on rocks or tree limbs in a pond, you can see that red stripe, and you might have to look closely or look with binoculars, but it is visible. And they do prefer slow waters, so maybe a stream with some pools, or that ponded water in a lake, or other similar water body. Let's see, next slide, please. Yeah, as I mentioned before, they are an aquarium species, and their native range is the Midwest. But since they have been introduced, we are worried about their competition with native turtles. They have some diet overlap with other turtles, and so that could have a negative effect on our native turtles. And they are, similar, at least, from a distance probably, to other medium-sized turtles. But none of these other turtles have that red stripe behind the eye, so that's definitely a dead giveaway. The map turtle in the far right corner of the slide does have a different pattern on its on its head and limbs. If you look closely, the lines on those on its head look somewhat similar to topo lines on a map. And then the shell, it's not visible in that picture, but on a map turtle has some distinct edges on the back of the shell near the tail. The yellow belly slider is another introduced species, but that one has that distinct yellow stripe behind its eye, so it looks different than the red-eared slider. And the red-bellied turtle in the upper right picture, it looks rather large in that picture, but it can be similar size, and it has more red on its shell. It has some red stripes. They look a little pinkish in that photo, but the underside of the shell on its belly side is a pink salmon color. So that's how you tell the difference. Next slide, please. So the red-eared slider is, getting introduced to more and more places. We know of, it's getting to be more common in Eastern Pennsylvania and some of the Central Pennsylvania waterways as well, and has been reported from the Pittsburgh and Presque Isle Bay area up in near Erie, Pennsylvania. So that's one to watch for. Next slide, please. I'll mention the jumping worms that are really distinctive organism. They are an invasive earthworm, an introduced one. Of course, all of our earthworms in North America are introduced, but these ones are definitely a bit different. They have this gray-brown color, and the clitellum, the white stripe that encircles the body, is it's light colored, whereas the European earthworms, it's not as light colored, and and the European earthworms is raised, whereas this one is flat and flush to the body and encircles the whole body. These guys, you'll never find, just one of them. They're found, in lots of them together. And they're best known for their like thrashing kind of movements. Amy, could you click on the video, please? So you see that video. It's not sped up. It's, you see their behavior is really different from an earthworm. If you pick up a European earthworm, they move in kind of those, slow kind of contractions, which looks far different than these guys. And they produce this grainy, hard pellets, so the soil becomes like dried coffee grounds. So that's really distinctive as well, I think. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the jumping worms, they are an issue because of, the way they do change the soil, consuming that organic layer and the leaf litter, and compacting the soil. There's been some studies into how it changes the soil chemistry, altering the amounts of carbon and nitrogen in the soil, and some ongoing studies about how it might be changing some of the plant communities where the jumping worms occur. So it's one I think we're learning more about and watching to see how the research pans out. But certainly we need to be careful about spreading So if it's much easier, obviously, to prevent than to control this organism. So if you're, purchasing any kind of worms for baits or other uses, or purchasing any soil or plant materials, you definitely want to, keep an eye out for something like this, and definitely don't move material if you know you have jumping worms. Definitely clean, any equipment or gear you're using that's been in the soil before you take it to a new place. There's no known treatments for the jumping worms. So if you find them in your garden or home, you can, try to systematically remove them. And over time, you might be able to knock back the population. But you'd have to be careful, obviously, not to move them from one spot in your yard to another. But if you do collect them, then you can set them in a bucket or something and leave them out in the sun until they desiccate and then discard them. Next slide, please. The jumping worms are being reported from more and more places. The map on the left is from iNaturalist. And so it is being found a lot more in the region and a number of places and, around Pennsylvania. So that's one to watch for. Next slide, please. And then hemlock woolly adelgid is a big one in forestry. It's an insect in the Hemiptera family, the same family as the brown marmorated stink bug, which a lot of people know from being around their homes in the warmer months. And it's an insect with sucking mouth parts that was brought to North America from Japan. It's discovered, or you can recognize it by the white woolly masses that are found where the base of the hemlock needle meets the twig. So they don't occur on the actual leaf of the hemlock, but on the twig itself. And the white masses are about the size of a half of a cotton swab. And the females lay their eggs in those masses, and sometimes they also overwinter in those spots. The masses can be found on the lower branches, and I understand that infestations start on the lower branches and go up. So if you have a stand of hemlocks, you can keep an eye on them by checking the lower limbs and turning over the twigs on the branches to keep checking for these guys. As they infest the twigs, you'll see that they prevent the needles from receiving nutrition from the tree, and so they start to turn gray and fall off. Next slide, please. Yeah, hemlock woolly adelgid is becoming really widespread in Pennsylvania. This map here shows the counties infested, and a lot of them have been, most of them have been infested at this point. This map is from 2019, so only 3 counties at that point didn't have records for hemlock woolly adelgid. So you'd be lucky if you have a hemlock stand and don't have a hemlock woolly adelgid. They do cause the tree to slowly die, from a period of 4 years and up. A tree might die. You'll see the branches slowly die back and the tree becomes stressed, and ultimately leading to its death. And unfortunately, this is causing a change in the community along streamside forests. And there are some, we're getting close to 2:30, so I'll wrap up. There are some other insects, but I won't go into that. Next slide, please. There are a number of treatment options, and I think just so we have a few minutes, I won't go into them, but I'll just say that there's a lot of resources available, and this USDA guide, we include it. It's on the slide here. We include it in one of our links in the presentation, and there's also a really nice guide that DCNR puts out. So I think I'll just hand it over to Amy, and hopefully we'll have time for a couple questions.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Yeah, we just have a few quick things before we go to our questions that I want to mention. And since we're getting close on time, I'll just run through these really fast. So just want to talk about, we've mentioned several times already by each of the presenters about the iMapInvasives program. So we do encourage you, if you find any of these species that we talked about here today, or any other invasive species that you might know about, to report it to iMapInvasives. Again, it's a really great and fairly intuitive platform to use. You can use your phone with a mobile app to report things. You can also sign online with your computer to report things that way as well. And then once that's been confirmed by an expert, that's really useful data to be able to understand the distributions for these species, and also to understand where treatment is occurring, because control efforts can be documented in iMapInvasives as well. More training is actually will be provided by myself coming up on April 7th to this group. So we're not going to go too deep into IMAP today because we will have another training at another time. We do want to mention that one of the key things whenever you talk about invasive species is the resources to know how to manage them properly. And that is different for pretty much all of these species. And so because we didn't have a ton of time to talk about the management, we did at least want to provide that here in our presentation. And Brian has a PDF version of the PowerPoint that these links will then be easy to use and access these resources to check those out. So we do have resources for management for all of these species that we talked about here today. And then lastly, we just wanted to kind of give you a perspective of the importance of some of these species. And so the DCNR has an invasive plant list where they rank species based on the threat that they pose to native communities. And all 10 of the species that we've talked about here today are on the DCNR invasive plant list. And you can see how they are currently ranked on there. So porcelainberry, mile-a-minute, kudzu, knotweed, purple loosestrife, bush honeysuckle, and water chestnut are all considered severe threats. And autumn olive, Chinese bush clover, and small carpetgrass are each considered a significant threat. And then just to wrap things up, 5 of the 10 plant species that we've talked about here today are currently on the Pennsylvania noxious weed list. And that list is actually growing. There's a control plant and noxious weed committee that comes together every few months to talk about potential additions to that list. And actually knotweed is one of the newer ones that was just recently added. And so there's definitions here of what the Class A and Class B noxious weeds actually, what that means. But just to show you that some of those plants that we talked about here today are also considered noxious weeds, which means that, you know, number one, they're prohibited for sale. And number two, where feasible, we're trying to eradicate them if it's a Class A. And Class B, if possible, we try to at least treat them or at least provide more information so people are aware of the severity of these species. And that wraps up our presentation. So Brian, I'm going to turn it back over to you. And if there's questions that folks have, if we have time to answer them, we're all here. We can take a stab at trying to answer those questions.
If folks do have questions, you can feel free to please use that chat box there. I did notice some comments that even within the red-eared slider, you know, so some invasives in one area are natives in another area. So is it a matter of, you know, just controlling and making sure that we're not introducing certain species that are more, you know, detrimental to other areas? Or what are some of the best practices for making sure some of these you know, different biological issues don't occur?
Well, yeah, I mean, about, say, something like the slider that's native to one part of the country but not native to another. I can see how the definition of native might be need to be kind of parsed out a little bit, but this presentation was targeting, you know, a Pennsylvania audience, even though we have folks from other places. So I'm concerned about species from one watershed or one region being transplanted to another, where they might be altering an ecosystem or competing with native species or causing other kinds of damage.
Gotcha. So it's just something to be aware of, especially as we start seeing more exotic plants coming in and people putting, you know, a beautiful flower into their yard, and then next thing you know is it takes over your neighbor's yard and then the entire neighborhood. And I saw earlier Steve had a picture of some grass that people have, you know, it leaves nice approach, or it looks good, but it's not necessarily what people are have in mind when they're putting it into the ground. So I guess it's a matter of educating yourself of what you're putting into your own environment.
Yeah, I can speak a little more to that. If you're planting something that's not native to your area, you should always be real careful about that and look and see if it's ever been invasive anywhere else. It's really better just to plant things that people have been planting here for a long time and have not shown any tendency to become invasive. There are certain things, though, that are red flags, like if it's a vine. You'll notice there are a lot of vines today. Vines are edge species, and you know so they're native to the kind of habitats where non-natives tend to get established, and sometimes those same species will move further away from the edge into natural habitats, which is, you know, when we say invasive species in the strict sense, we're talking about species that occupy relatively intact natural habitats and displace native species. But it's a spectrum. You know, also, if it's closely related to a species that's become that is invasive, you know, if you have, oh, here's a Raynautria that they're selling, and it's not the one that's invasive, so let me plant that. If its close relative is invasive, there's a good chance that it has that potential also.
Well, this has been very informative. I want to thank our panelists for their time. This has been fantastic and a wealth of knowledge. You know, thinking of this on the park management side of things, I was constantly putting other resources aside from what we have in the PDF for control methods and just different ways of making sure that we can educate ourselves on these different species. And is there a, you know, thinking on a broader national kind of scope, is there a best location that people can look at, whether it be USDA, or is it a matter of talking to your university extensions? And what is a good way for people in any state to really educate themselves and learn more?
So I think that because, as you touched on earlier, you know, some species can be native to one region and invasive in another. There really isn't, as far as I know, what I would recommend anyway at a national scale place to look for that information. It's really best to try to hone in on your area, and the more local you can get, the better the information will likely be. So Penn State Extension for Pennsylvania is an excellent resource to look at, especially for management recommendations. They recently came out with some digital fact sheets that talk about some of the species that we went over today. DCNR is another really great resource to tap into. And even the county conservation districts, a lot of them are very involved with invasive species efforts and have some folks on staff that are very knowledgeable on these things. So really, I think that keeping within your state is the best place to go to as far as resources. And even, you know, us here with the Conservancy and the Heritage Program, if people, you know, would like to reach out to us specifically, you know, we certainly, we don't have a ton of capacity to give to this because we have other projects we're doing, but we are willing to help if people have questions, and we can try to steer people in the right direction as needed.
Well, that's great advice. And every state does have a conservation department within their control. So that is a great outreach, and any land grant school does have those extension programs that they can reach out to, and they are very helpful. So those are all good things. And of course, I have been gathering all of the information for our region and everything that you've given me, and we keep all of that on the Institute website as well. So people can log in, check out. I put that in the chat box as well. So we hope to invite you all to join us again and visit with us. And on April 7th, we will be talking with Amy, and I believe Mary as well, about the iMapInvasives specifically and how to use those tools. So thank you again, everyone. I'm BK, Director of the Pennsylvania Park Maintenance Institute, and we look forward to hosting you again in the future.
Thank you, Brian.